Kat was 26 years old when she left for what she described to her friends as a trip across the Nevada desert. She had always been the kind of person who gravitated toward long stretches of highway and isolated towns, drawn to silence in places where few others ventured. Driving an older silver Honda Civic, the car itself reflected years of travel and miles of wear. The windshield was cracked in a narrow line that stretched across the passenger side, and the rear bumper carried only a single faded sticker. That car was her companion, her shield, and in the days that followed, the last physical trace anyone could connect to her. Her plan was never complicated. She wanted to escape into open space, follow roads until they ended, and take photographs of the empty places in between. She told her closest friends that she would be in touch by the weekend, once she settled somewhere that offered both quiet and a signal strong enough to call. When she drove away, nothing suggested that she would never return. Witnesses later recalled seeing someone who resembled Kat at a gas station outside a desert town. The details were subtle, but consistent. A young woman with brown hair tied back, moving quickly, appearing distracted. She filled the tank of a silver car while glancing at her phone. One clerk remembered her fumbling with her wallet, as if pressed for time, eyes darting more than once toward the dark highway ahead. There was no recorded conversation, no transaction beyond the routine purchase of fuel, but it became one of the final sightings that investigators could verify. When the weekend passed without a call to her parents, concern set in quickly. At first, her friends thought she might have extended her trip by a day or two, caught up in the rhythm of travel. But Kat was known for reliability when it came to checking in. If she promised to call, she always followed through. That silence soon felt unnatural, and her family's worry grew sharper with every unanswered message. Her parents filed a missing persons report, and within hours, deputies and volunteers began tracing the highways she was believed to have traveled. Search teams walked ditches, scanned roadside motels, and spoke to attendants at gas stations along her possible route. They looked for tire marks veering off the road, fragments of glass, or clothing that might link back to her. Nothing surfaced. The absence was striking. Cars leave traces, oil stains, rubber on asphalt, receipts in convenience stores. People leave traces too. Conversations overheard, names on guest ledgers, belongings dropped in haste. In Kat's case, there was nothing. The car seemed to vanish with her, erasing the normal evidence investigators depend upon. The desert itself added to the difficulty. Vast, silent, and indifferent, it stretched in every direction. Searchers described the terrain as both open and concealing, wide enough to swallow a vehicle, harsh enough to discourage prolonged effort. Every mile of empty highway blurred into the next, with stretches of rock and sand that seemed endless. In such conditions, absence becomes its own form of presence, a reminder of how easily someone can disappear. The story of Kat's disappearance quickly spread across her hometown, then across state lines. Flyers bearing her photograph appeared in grocery stores, libraries, and rest stops. Media outlets covered the case with brief segments, noting the mystery of a young woman gone missing during what should have been a simple road trip. Friends and strangers alike joined online groups, exchanging theories and coordinating search efforts. Yet, despite growing attention, every lead returned the same result: silence. Investigators held on to the detail of the silver Honda Civic. If the car was found, they reasoned, Kat might be found as well, or at least answers could emerge from what remained inside. But no highway patrols reported seeing it, no impounds listed it, and no abandoned vehicle matched its description. It was as if both the driver and the machine had been absorbed by the desert night. Her parents described the experience of waiting as unbearable. Each ring of the phone carried the hope of new information. Each knock at the door carried dread. They replayed the last conversations, searching for clues in her words. She had said she wanted quiet, that she wanted to chase the feeling of distance. Now that distance had become literal, vast, and seemingly permanent. The desert stood unchanged, silent as ever. Roads stretched forward, towns remained scattered, and beneath the surface of stillness, the absence of one traveler grew heavier with time. 14 years after Kat's disappearance, the desert had changed little. The wide expanse of pale sand, scattered brush, and heat-shimmering horizons still stretched in every direction. It was on an otherwise ordinary afternoon that a construction driver, maneuvering heavy equipment across a tract of undeveloped land, noticed something unusual. At first glance, it appeared to be nothing more than a glint, a fragment catching the sun. But, as the machine passed over the ground, the driver caught sight of a sliver of metallic grey pushing through the hard-packed soil. It was out of place, far too smooth and reflective to be a natural stone. The driver stopped the equipment, climbed down, and approached. Kneeling in the dirt, he brushed away at the surface. What emerged was not rock, but painted metal, edges dulled by time and grit. It was enough to raise suspicion, enough to prompt a call that would soon bring investigators to the site. Word spread quickly. Something was buried beneath the desert floor. Excavators arrived, their engines cutting across the silence. Carefully, they began to remove layers of sand and dust hardened by years of desert winds. Slowly, the shape of a vehicle emerged, tilted downward, its front end buried nose first into the earth. As more soil was cleared away, the contours became unmistakable. What they were pulling from the desert was not scrap, not construction debris. It was a car. When investigators moved in, they examined the number plates. The sequence was quickly run against records. Confirmation came almost immediately. The plates matched those of Kat's Honda, the car she had last been seen driving on the day she vanished 14 years earlier. The discovery sent a ripple through the community. For years, the case had lingered in silence. Now, there was something tangible, a piece of evidence emerging from beneath the desert's surface. The car itself presented a disturbing picture. It was largely intact, though weathered by time underground. The windows were unbroken, the doors locked tight. Dust and fine grit had forced their way into the interior, coating every surface in a thick film. The sight was chilling. The vehicle seemed frozen in time, as though sealed away deliberately, hidden with intent. Investigators moved cautiously, treating the scene as a potential gravesite. Neighbors and bystanders gathered at the edge of the excavation, their voices hushed, their attention fixed on the vehicle being pulled into view. Many had lived in the area for decades. Some remembered the search for Kat, the posters, the unanswered questions. Now, as the Honda was lifted from the ground, the whispers spread. Could she still be inside? The answer came when officers pried open the locked doors and looked within. The interior, though filled with dust, still held objects that had once belonged to her. On the passenger seat, investigators found folded maps, yellowed with age. The driver's side seatbelt was frayed and torn, as if it had been pulled or cut at some point. In the back seat lay a backpack, zipped shut, its contents untouched after so many years. Every discovery deepened the mystery. Most striking was the absence of what many feared they might find. Kat herself was not in the vehicle. No human remains, no traces of her presence at the time of burial. The car had been hidden away, but the woman at the center of the search remained missing. This realization added another layer of unease. Someone had taken deliberate steps to bury the vehicle, to lock it, to seal it from view. But why? And what did it mean for the fate of Kat? For investigators, the buried car became both a breakthrough and a riddle. On one hand, it was direct evidence, the single largest clue to emerge since her disappearance. On the other, it posed questions that reached beyond simple explanation. Who had access to heavy equipment capable of burying a car in this way? When had it been done? And under what circumstances? As the dust settled around the excavation site, the reality was clear. The Honda had been hidden with precision. The maps, the torn seatbelt, the sealed backpack. These objects told fragments of a story, but none could explain its ending. Kat remained absent, her fate unresolved. The discovery, instead of closing the case, widened its scope. It shifted the investigation from a disappearance to something far more complex, pointing toward intent and concealment. 14 years of silence had been broken by a sliver of metal in the sand, and yet the central mystery remained untouched. The chapter closed not with resolution, but with renewed uncertainty. A car had been unearthed, a scene frozen in time, and a woman still missing. The desert had given up one secret, but it left behind the larger question: who buried Kat's car, and why? Detectives recovered the backpack after days of searching terrain near a dry wash, its fabric weathered and streaked with desert dust. Sun exposure had faded its original color into muted tones, but the zippers remained intact. For investigators, the backpack represented the first tangible object directly tied to Kat since her disappearance. When officers unzipped it, they found belongings that carried both familiarity and unease. At the top were a pair of hiking boots, scuffed but still functional, as if they had been worn on more than one excursion. Below that lay a driver's license issued in Kat's name, its lamination beginning to curl from heat exposure. That license confirmed the item's link to her, eliminating any doubt about ownership. Then came the unexpected discovery. Resting between the boots and license was a disposable camera. Its plastic casing was scratched, but the winding mechanism still turned. Investigators recognized it as an older model, often used for quick snapshots in places where phones might fail or where photographs were meant to be left undeveloped until later. But the most unusual item lay at the bottom: a single folded paper. Detectives opened it carefully, revealing a hand-drawn map. Unlike ordinary road maps, this sketch contained no highways, no town names, and no official markers. Instead, it traced winding dirt trails and dry washes, the kinds of paths that cut across unpaved ground in rural Nevada. Some lines ended abruptly, others curved toward shaded areas resembling ridges or arroyos. What made the discovery striking was the handwriting. Experts familiar with Kat's journal entries and school records compared samples and confirmed the script did not match hers. The lettering style was heavier, the strokes uneven, as though drawn quickly or by someone unfamiliar with drafting maps. The fact that the map existed at all and was tucked away among her belongings raised immediate questions. Investigators turned next to the disposable camera. The film was carefully developed under controlled conditions, frame by frame revealing glimpses of Kat's final days. Several photographs showed wide desert horizons. The sky stretched above dunes and mesas. Others depicted gas stations, isolated outposts of fluorescent light surrounded by empty lots. These images aligned with witness accounts of Kat refueling before vanishing deeper into the desert night. Then came the photograph that changed the direction of the investigation. One frame captured a man leaning against a truck. The image was blurred, likely taken in haste or with unsteady hands. His face lacked definition, but the outline of his posture and clothing was visible. The truck, older and boxy, appeared parked near an open area of dirt, not a paved station. No one who reviewed the photograph recognized the man. He did not match any initial witnesses. The implications grew heavier. The backpack was not simply a collection of personal effects. It introduced new elements that shifted the case away from a solitary disappearance and toward the possibility of another individual's involvement. Who had drawn the map? Why was it placed with her belongings? And who was the unidentified figure standing beside the truck? Detectives revisited timelines, attempting to connect the backpack's contents with earlier reports. Could Kat have encountered someone who guided her off main roads? The handmade map suggested knowledge of unmarked terrain, routes that only locals or seasoned wanderers would know. If it was handed to her, it may have been intended as guidance. If planted later, it might have been a diversion. Either way, its existence demanded attention. The The camera photographs deepened this uncertainty. Kat's pattern of capturing gas stations and landscapes was consistent with her known habits of documenting travel, but the final frame, with its ambiguous subject, was unlike the others. Investigators questioned whether she had intended to photograph the man openly, or whether the shot was accidental, perhaps taken without his awareness. At this stage, the backpack became more than evidence. It became a pivot point. Media coverage highlighted the discovery, describing it as the most significant clue since her disappearance. Public speculation grew, though investigators remained measured, focusing only on verifiable details. They released statements confirming the backpack's authenticity, acknowledging the presence of the hand-drawn map, and confirming the undeveloped camera had produced usable images. They did not disclose every detail but admitted that one photograph contained an unidentified subject. For Kat's family, the discovery brought mixed emotions. Relief surfaced at finally having something concrete, a trace of her in physical form, yet dread accompanied it too, as the strange contents suggested her journey had intersected with someone else's intentions. The belongings raised more questions than they answered. The investigation pressed forward. Detectives circulated the blurry photograph internally, comparing it to databases of known offenders and missing persons. They studied the truck for identifiable features but found none definitive. The map was traced against satellite images to determine whether the drawn paths corresponded to real terrain. Preliminary results suggested accuracy. The map aligned with lesser-known trails outside documented road networks. Whoever drew it knew the land. With these findings, the case shifted. The desert was no longer seen solely as an indifferent void that consumed a traveler. Instead, attention turned toward the possibility of human involvement. The backpack suggested intersection, a meeting, intentional or accidental, between Kat and another presence. Detectives working the case knew that photographs had a way of unlocking doors. The image in question was blurry, captured from a surveillance camera years earlier. It showed a man beside a truck, features partially obscured, details softened by grain and time. Yet even in its haziness, the photograph carried weight. For investigators, it was not just an image. It was a possible connection, a thread leading back to the night Kat vanished. They began by canvassing local truck stops, the kinds of places where long-haul drivers passed through, and small-town waitresses remembered faces better than names. The photograph was passed from hand to hand, pinned to corkboards, laid across diner counters. At one stop, a waitress paused. She leaned closer, eyes narrowing at the blurred truck in the background of the picture. She didn't claim to recognize the man himself, but the vehicle struck her memory with certainty. "That truck," she said. "I've seen it. He used to come through here, always at night." Her recollection didn't end there. She remembered him not as just another face on the highway, but as someone who sometimes brought company. Once, she said, he had a young woman with him. The woman didn't speak much. She sat quietly, hands clasped, eyes darting toward the door, as if waiting for an escape that never came. The waitress remembered her as nervous, withdrawn, the opposite of someone freely traveling with a friend. Detectives pressed for details. What color was the truck? What set it apart? The waitress described a faded red pickup, its paint dulled, one of the side mirrors missing. She had watched it pull away from the parking lot more than once, disappearing into the darkness that stretched beyond the truck stop lights. With this lead, investigators turned to records. They cross-checked vehicle descriptions, old registrations and citations in the region around the time Kat disappeared. Slowly the profile began to narrow. A name surfaced. A drifter, a mechanic by trade, known to drift between jobs and towns, leaving little trace behind. He had been in the area in 2007, the very year Kat vanished. The man fits the kind of transient pattern investigators often struggled with. He had no fixed residence, no stable employer. His work as a mechanic kept him close to trucks and vehicles, giving him both knowledge and mobility. The faded red pickup with the missing mirror matched what witnesses recalled. The alignment was enough to move the search forward. Detectives traced him to what records suggested was his last known address, a trailer positioned off a lonely desert road. The location was remote, a place easily missed by passers-by. By the time investigators arrived, the trailer stood abandoned. Wind rattled its frame, dust gathered at its steps, and silence settled over its interior. Inside, the structure bore the marks of vacancy. Furniture was gone, personal items stripped away, leaving only the hollow shell of walls and empty rooms. Cabinets swung open, empty shelves coated in dust. Investigators moved methodically, documenting each space, searching for any sign of Kat, any trace that she might have been there. But the trailer yielded little at first glance. The emptiness itself was telling. It suggested flight, a hurried departure, or a deliberate effort to erase a past. Forensic teams noted scuff marks on the floor, places where heavy objects might once have rested. They collected samples of soil tracked inside, hoping that later analysis could link it to other sites. Still, no direct evidence of Kat appeared. Detectives considered the implications. The man in the photograph, connected to a distinct vehicle, matched to a location that now stood stripped bare. Each piece pointed to involvement, yet none provided the definitive answer. Was this the place where Kat had been brought? Had she sat quietly at the truck stop, later to vanish into the shadows of this trailer? The questions remained unanswered. Neighbors in the area offered little. Few had interacted with the man. Those who had described him as quiet, solitary, someone who kept to himself and moved on without explanation. His absence now seemed deliberate, a closing of a door just before authorities arrived to knock. For investigators, the trailer was not just a physical space, but a symbol of the wider challenge in the case. Leads surfaced and then faded. Objects appeared and then disappeared, and time worked against the clarity they sought. Still, the photograph, the waitress's testimony, and the abandoned trailer tied together a path that seemed impossible to dismiss. Though the trailer appeared empty, detectives remained cautious. Structures often hold secrets, sometimes hidden within walls, beneath floorboards, or behind panels. What seemed vacant could still contain overlooked evidence. The question lingered. Had they truly seen everything the trailer had to reveal? The trailer stood on the edge of a forgotten lot, its aluminum siding dented and weathered by years of neglect. Curtains hung uneven in the windows, and the yard surrounding it was scattered with remnants of machinery, rusted cans, and pieces of broken equipment. For investigators, this was more than just a drifter's dwelling. It was a potential container of answers, a place where objects might linger even when people vanished. When officers entered, they described the interior as sparse yet unsettling. The air was stale, heavy with dust. Furniture was mismatched, surfaces cluttered with tools, cigarette butts, and the remains of meals left half-finished. Nothing about the space suggested warmth or permanence. Instead, it reflected transience, the habits of someone accustomed to moving but staying just long enough to leave layers of debris behind. It was during the systematic search that detectives noticed a section of the trailer floor that seemed uneven. A single board flexed differently beneath the weight of a boot. Suspecting it concealed storage, officers pried it open. Beneath, they discovered a narrow compartment. Inside rested a rusted toolbox, its surface corroded, its latch stiff from years of disuse. Opening the box revealed objects that would alter the course of the investigation. Inside was a set of keys, a torn Nevada highway map, and a necklace. The keys appeared ordinary, each attached to a dull ring, their origins not immediately clear. The highway map was folded unevenly, edges frayed, sections smeared with oil stains and dust. What remained legible showed routes across state lines, with Nevada's interior stretches highlighted in thick pen. But the necklace stood apart. The necklace was delicate, a chain that time had not dulled. When detectives presented it to Kat's mother, recognition came instantly. She identified it as her daughter's, explaining it had been a gift given years before and was seldom removed. For investigators, that confirmation was pivotal. The necklace established a direct connection between Kat and the trailer's hidden compartment, tying her presence, or at least her belongings, to the drifter's environment. Yet the discovery complicated rather than clarified. Beyond the necklace, there was no physical trace of Kat, no clothing, no personal documents, no signs of her having stayed there. The box held pieces of potential meaning, but it lacked context. How her necklace ended up beneath that floorboard remained unanswered. Forensic teams took possession of the items, subjecting each to careful analysis. The map was examined for notes or annotations, but aside from torn edges and stains, it revealed nothing beyond routes already known. The keys were checked against local locks and vehicles, but none matched. Attention focused heavily on the necklace. Its significance was both personal and evidentiary. Tests confirmed the presence of fingerprints on its surface. This discovery raised hopes of narrowing the suspect pool. Yet results delivered an unexpected turn. The prints did not belong to the drifter, who had been the primary focus of suspicion. Instead, they matched an unknown profile not yet identified in any criminal database. This revelation unsettled the investigation. Until then, the drifter's orbit had seemed the central path. His trailer, his lifestyle, his proximity to the desert where Kat vanished, all of it pointed toward involvement. But the fingerprints told a different story. They introduced another person into the chain of possession. Someone else had handled the necklace, someone who had not been previously considered. Investigators now faced layered uncertainty. Was the drifter merely storing objects that passed through other hands? Did he acquire the necklace second-hand, unknowingly keeping evidence? Or was he connected to another individual who left the print? Theories could multiply, but detectives stayed cautious, limiting conclusions to what could be proven. Media outlets reported cautiously as well. Stories acknowledged the necklace had been found and tied to Kat, but emphasized the puzzling development of the unknown fingerprint. Families following the case read the news with renewed anxiety. For Kat's parents, the confirmation of the necklace's presence was both devastating and grounding. Proof their daughter's path had crossed into the orbit of this trailer, but the fingerprint widened the circle of possibility, suggesting someone closer might be entangled in her disappearance. The trailer's compartment, once hidden, now stood as a silent marker of contradiction. It held undeniable evidence of Kat, yet raised more questions than it answered. Each object pointed outward: the map to roads, the keys to locks, the necklace to identity. None of them delivered closure. Detectives knew that circles often close in unexpected ways. After years of chasing distant leads, construction sites, truck stops, abandoned trailers, they returned to the people who had known Kat best. Friends, classmates, and co-workers were interviewed again, this time with sharper questions. In cases that stretch across decades, memory often fades, but sometimes what lingers is the one overlooked truth. Among Kat's college friends was a woman who had stayed relatively quiet during the initial inquiries. When investigators revisited her, she seemed uneasy, though cooperative. She admitted to something she had never fully explained before. In the days leading up to Kat's disappearance, she had introduced her to a man. The way she phrased it was casual. He was someone who knew all the desert back roads. She described the introduction as harmless, almost incidental. At the time, she thought nothing of it. The revelation caught investigators' attention immediately. Kat had vanished in a desert region, along routes unfamiliar to most outsiders. The idea that she had been introduced to someone with precise knowledge of those roads shifted the focus. Who was this man? And why had his name never surfaced until now? Detectives pressed for details. The friend explained that the introduction had taken place in a social setting. She insisted it was nothing more than a chance connection, a brief meeting without consequence. She had not considered the link important until now. Her explanation seemed plausible on the surface, but investigators knew better than to dismiss coincidences. They requested every name, every possible lead that could connect back to that moment. Forensic teams were simultaneously working with evidence collected from the buried car. One item in particular, a fingerprint lifted from an object inside, had been run through databases. Initially, it did not match known offenders. But when investigators expanded their scope, searching connections through friends and relatives of Kat's circle, the system returned a result. The print matched the brother of the very friend now admitting to the introduction. The connection was undeniable. What began as a casual recollection had evolved into a direct forensic link. Investigators confronted the friend with the result. She seemed startled, insisting she had no idea her brother's print could have been on anything connected to Kat. She repeated that her role was only an introduction, nothing more. Attention turned to the brother. When questioned, he denied any significant involvement. He acknowledged knowing Kat only in passing, through his sister. He claimed they had never spent time alone, never travelled together, and certainly had no deeper connection. His tone was calm, his denial rehearsed. But investigators were already looking beyond words. Phone records painted a different picture. Calls logged from his number placed him in Nevada at the very time Kat vanished. The timing and location directly contradicted his account. If he truly had no connection, why was he in the same region during the same week, years earlier? The discrepancy stood out. Investigators weighed the possibility that he had lied about his movements. In many cases, such lies are not mere misstatements, but intentional efforts to distance oneself from suspicion. The fingerprint in the vehicle, combined with the phone record, created a convergence too precise to ignore. When pressed on the contradiction, he deflected. He said he might have been passing through, that work sometimes took him across state lines, yet no employment records confirmed such travel at that time. His story faltered under scrutiny, each detail raising more doubt. For detectives, the situation cut in two directions. On one hand, the evidence was growing. A fingerprint tied him physically to the case, and the phone records tied him geographically to the timeline. On the other, his sister's involvement complicated the narrative. Had she withheld the truth deliberately, or had she genuinely not realized the importance of what she knew? Her testimony suggested naivety, but the delay in disclosure raised questions about loyalty, fear, or protection. The circle that had once seemed peripheral was suddenly central. Kat's disappearance no longer revolved around strangers glimpsed at truck stops or anonymous drifters on desert roads. The investigation had come back to someone within reach, someone tethered not just by circumstance but by personal connection. Detectives debated the implications. The brother's denial, set against the backdrop of physical and digital evidence, could not be overlooked. A man who had supposedly only met Kat once was now tied to her car, to her disappearance, and to her last known location. The reasons for his deception remained hidden, but the fact of it was undeniable. What lingered was the core question investigators voiced quietly among themselves. If he was innocent, why had he lied? Cell phone records often become the most reliable narrators in cases where voices have vanished. In Kat's disappearance, it was no different. When investigators pulled her call history from the night she went missing, one particular entry stood out. At 9:47 p.m., her phone dialed a number tied to someone within her circle, her brother's. The record indicated that the call connected. The duration lasted just under 40 seconds. Though brief, It was significant. In a case where every moment of that night had been examined and re-examined, this small window introduced an entirely new line of questioning. Her brother, when asked, claimed he never picked up the call. He maintained that if the phone connected, it must have rung without his noticing, or that it ended before he answered. His explanation suggested coincidence, the kind of overlooked call that happens easily in everyday life. But investigators, cautious by necessity, pressed further. Phone tower data complicated his account. Analysis revealed that his phone had been pinged near the very gas station where Kat was last seen alive. The tower records placed him within the coverage radius at nearly the same time. Witnesses recalled seeing her hurried, nervous, filling her tank. This overlap between her final confirmed movements and his phone's location shifted the investigation's weight. Presented with the data, he altered his account. No longer denying awareness of the call, he now admitted that a brief exchange might have occurred. According to his revised statement, Kat had asked for directions, little more. He claimed the call was casual, without urgency, and ended as abruptly as it began. For detectives, his explanation raised more questions than it answered. Why would Kat, a seasoned traveller familiar with highways, maps and the rhythm of the road, call her brother for directions in the middle of a desert trip? Why him, specifically? And why at that hour? The narrative strained against logic, especially in light of the fact that his fingerprint had already been discovered on her necklace, hidden beneath the trailer floorboard. The combination of these two threads, the necklace and the call, built a troubling pattern. Investigators began to outline possible scenarios. If the print linked him to her belongings and the call linked him to her final movements, then his role in the case could not be reduced to coincidence. Even if his claims were truthful, they left gaps too wide to reconcile. Detectives noted how his statements shifted only when evidence contradicted his previous denials. First, he insisted he had not picked up. Then, when shown tower data, he admitted to limited interaction. Each adjustment diminished credibility. Investigators recognized the signs of someone attempting to minimize involvement without severing ties completely. The timeline, already fragile, now seemed to bend around this call. Forensic analysts cross-referenced the exact moment of connection with Kat's known location. The gas station's surveillance system had failed to capture the interaction, leaving no visual confirmation. But the circumstantial overlap remained firm. Kat was seen there. Her phone reached out. His phone was nearby. Publicly, law enforcement released no details about the brothers' involvement. Privately, they weighed the consequences of drawing family members into the suspect pool. Families of missing persons often fracture under the strain of suspicion, and this case was no exception. For Kat's parents, the possibility that one child might be tied to the disappearance of another carried unbearable weight. The necklace loomed large over every interview. Forensic reports confirmed its print was his. When questioned directly, he could not explain why. He suggested perhaps he had touched it long before, in a moment forgotten. An accidental contact that persisted on the chain. Experts countered that the likelihood of such a print surviving through time, travel and storage was minimal. The impression appeared fresher, more consistent with recent handling. This contradiction between his explanation and the evidence deepened distrust. Investigators considered whether the necklace had passed between Kat and her brother before her disappearance, or whether it had been transferred under circumstances he was unwilling to admit. Ultimately, the unanswered questions piled higher than the answers. The call, short, silent and unverified beyond his account, marked the last documented communication from Kat's phone. That it connected directly to her brother made it impossible to ignore. The investigation now turned toward communication records in fuller detail. Every text, every voicemail, every interaction became a puzzle piece. Analysts combed through databases, searching for overlooked fragments of her final attempts to reach out. It was within this deeper search that a new discovery emerged. A voicemail tied to the same window of time, hidden in records that had gone unnoticed at first. For years, Kat's parents had lived with the silence of their daughter's disappearance. They had given interviews, opened their home to investigators, and endured endless questions without answers. Yet through it all, they held on to one piece of evidence no one else had ever heard. When detectives returned to speak with them again, they revealed it. An old voicemail, saved from the very night she vanished. The message had been left on the family's home phone, an artifact from the mid-2000s. Its presence was both haunting and fragile, preserved across outdated technology, carefully replayed but never erased. Her parents had kept it not because it offered clarity, but because it was the last time they heard her voice. When investigators listened, the sound was immediate and unsettling. Kat's voice came through thin and wavering. "I'm not alone out here," she said, the words carrying fear, the edges shaking. Then came the next phrase, barely audible over static. "Something's wrong." The line cut in and out as if the connection was failing. In the background, faint but distinct, was another sound. A muffled male voice, fragmented by distance and interference, echoed for just a second. And then the call ended. No goodbye, no explanation, only silence. Detectives recognized the gravity of what they were hearing. It was not speculation, not second-hand memory. It was Kat herself, speaking on the night she disappeared, describing her situation in real time. Her fear was captured in her own words. The voicemail shifted the investigation from theory to documented fact. She had not been alone. Audio analysts were brought in to examine the recording. They worked to filter out distortion, to separate the layers of sound buried in the static. Hours of technical processing yielded a clearer version of the male voice. Though brief and muffled, its tone and cadence became more defined. Experts compared it to known samples gathered during interviews. The results were sobering. The timbre, rhythm, and resonance matched the brother of Kat's college friend, the same man already tied to the case by fingerprint and phone records. Investigators had suspected his proximity before. Now they had evidence placing him in direct presence with Kat at the moment she expressed fear for her safety. Detectives confronted the implications. The voicemail suggested that Kat's final moments of freedom included an unwanted companion. Her words, "I'm not alone out here," implied surprise, alarm, or both. The follow-up, "Something's wrong," carried urgency, a recognition that her situation had shifted into danger. And the male voice, faint but undeniable, anchored that danger to someone investigators had already been scrutinizing. Still, challenges remained. The voicemail, while powerful, was circumstantial. Courts demand more than fear and implication. There was no body, no definitive crime scene, no direct proof of violence. Without those elements, investigators could not state conclusively what had happened. What they had was a chilling recording, connecting Kat's voice, her fear, and his presence in the same moment. For her parents, the revelation was bittersweet. They had preserved the message out of grief and love, holding it as the last fragment of their daughter's life. Now it became a cornerstone of the case. The sound of her voice, terrified, pleading without words, became both a comfort and a wound. Detectives returned again to the broader picture: the buried car, the fingerprint, the Nevada phone records, and now the voicemail, all converged on the same individual. Each piece alone might be explained away, but together they built a framework, difficult to dismiss. Yet without Kat's body, the case remained suspended, poised between discovery and absence. Analysts emphasized one more detail: the way the call ended. It did not close with a conscious decision, no sound of a phone being hung up. Instead, it cut abruptly as if interrupted. The suddenness implied interference. A dropped device, a forceful end. The moment replayed in investigators' minds, the silence after the words echoing as much as the message itself. What the voicemail proved was presence. What it hinted at was coercion. What it left unresolved was the final outcome. Detectives left Kat's parents' home carrying a recording that had waited more than a decade to be heard officially. It was both a breakthrough and a reminder of what remained missing. The search for Kat could not rest on voices alone. Something more tangible would be required. The return to the desert site where Kat's car had been discovered carried the weight of unfinished business. For investigators, the vehicle had always felt like a partial answer, a clue that revealed little beyond its presence. Its burial in sand suggested deliberate concealment, but surrounding ground had not been fully examined during the first search. Weeks later, armed with better equipment, detectives returned with ground-penetrating radar, determined to see what earlier efforts may have missed. The scans revealed subtle irregularities beneath the surface. A few yards away from the spot where the car had been unearthed, the radar marked an anomaly. Soil layers showed signs of disturbance inconsistent with the natural landscape. Detectives flagged the area and excavation began. Beneath several inches of compacted sand lay a shallow pit. The soil carried the scent of ash, a faint but undeniable trace of burning. Within it, searchers uncovered charred remnants, pieces of fabric reduced to brittle strands, and small fragments of bone, too degraded to identify at a glance. The discovery altered the site instantly. What had once been considered only a vehicle dump ground now bore the hallmarks of a second burial, one potentially tied to Kat herself. The fragments were carefully collected, each catalogued under forensic protocol. Scientists faced immediate challenges. The desert's harsh conditions, cycles of heat, dryness and erosion had accelerated degradation. Bones had been burned, further complicating the preservation of DNA. The fabrics, melted and brittle, resisted analysis beyond basic confirmation that they had once been part of clothing. Yet one object survived the fire and the weight of time. Amid the debris, investigators recovered a charm bracelet, warped by heat. Its links fused together. Though partially melted, the design was still recognizable. When presented to Kat's parents, recognition came immediately. They confirmed it was hers, describing how she had worn it since adolescence. The charms added gradually over years. Its survival in that pit drew a direct line between the fragments and Kat herself. For detectives, this discovery represented a turning point. Up to this stage, the case had existed within the boundaries of disappearance. Kat had been missing, her car concealed, her belongings scattered. Theories revolved around whether she might still be alive, hidden, or lost in the desert. With the recovery of bone fragments and a personal item fused by fire, the case crossed into new territory. It was no longer approached as a missing persons investigation. It now bore the legal and emotional weight of homicide. The shift carried consequences. Resources expanded. Specialists from homicide divisions joined the team, offering experience in burial analysis, burn pattern examination, and forensic anthropology. Every detail of the site, the depth of the pit, the distribution of ash, the layering of soil, was photographed, mapped, and studied. Investigators considered the sequence. The car buried first, or the pit? Were they connected events or separate acts meant to confuse? Forensic analysts struggled with the fragments. Bone too small to carry sufficient DNA complicated the attempt to match them to Kat. Samples were sent to specialized labs, but results came back inconclusive. The desert's conditions, combined with fire, left the material nearly beyond recovery. The absence of definitive identification meant that, legally, investigators could not declare the remains hers with absolute certainty. Still, the bracelet provided a powerful form of recognition. While not scientifically irrefutable, its confirmation by family made the connection undeniable in the eyes of those closest to her. For her parents, the bracelet's return was both a form of closure and a deep wound. It confirmed proximity to their daughter's fate, even as it withheld full answers. Detectives framed the discovery as pivotal. It demonstrated intent to destroy, to erase evidence, to conceal. Whoever had left that pit had engaged in purposeful activity far beyond accident or chance. The shallow depth suggested haste. The burning suggested control. Both together indicated a calculated attempt to eliminate traces of Kat. The term second burial began circulating among the investigative team. The car had been buried once, hidden beneath sand. Now the ground revealed another burial, this time of human material and personal effects. Two concealments within yards of each other suggested a larger orchestration, not random acts, but linked events carried out with awareness of the landscape and its isolating cover. This development reframed earlier evidence: the necklace in the trailer, the map tucked into the backpack, the blurred photo of a man against a truck. Each clue had once stood in isolation. With the burial site confirmed, all of them now pointed toward escalation, from disappearance to containment to destruction. For the investigation, the shallow pit was no longer just another anomaly in the desert. It was the moment the case officially shifted. Kat was not merely missing. She had been the victim of an act that sought to erase her entirely. When the Honda was unearthed, investigators immediately understood it was not a casual act of concealment. A car buried nose first beneath desert soil was not the work of hurried hands or improvised tools. It required precision, power, and planning. The question became not only who had buried it, but how. Forensic geologists were called to examine the site. They studied the layers of earth, tracing shifts in sediment and the compacted pressure surrounding the vehicle. Their analysis revealed the burial had been deliberate. The soil was not randomly disturbed. Instead, it displayed consistent striations, marks left by heavy equipment. This was no shallow pit dug in desperation. It was a trench, cut by machinery, refilled with purpose, and left to blend back into the landscape over time. Experts noted the car's position. It had been lowered nose first, the angle unnatural for any natural accident. The placement suggested lifting, controlled descent, and calculated covering. Such an operation required access to machinery capable of both excavation and lowering weight. Without such resources, the burial would have been impossible. Investigators turned to the logical next step: construction records. They began combing through rental logs and equipment invoices dating back to 2007, the year Kat vanished. Though nearly 14 years had passed, some records remained intact. Companies preserved contracts, names, and dates for liability. Piece by piece, the team cross-referenced logs against individuals tied to the case. One firm's records stood out. In the weeks surrounding Kat's disappearance, their equipment had been rented for a short-term job that left no lasting project attached. The renter's name was already familiar to detectives. It was the brother, the same man linked by fingerprint, phone records, and a voice on Kat's last voicemail. The discovery sharpened the focus. He not only knew the desert roads, but also had direct access to the machinery needed to bury a vehicle. The alignment of opportunity and evidence grew undeniable. Investigators could now place him at the center of both the means and the method. The implications were troubling. Renting equipment suggested foresight, not impulse. To bury a car intact required planning, securing the machine, choosing the site, transporting the vehicle, and ensuring no one witnessed the operation. Each step implied control, preparation, and intent to conceal. It was not the chaotic aftermath of an accident. It was the careful execution of a cover-up. For detectives, this marked a turning point. They could now explain not just where the car had been found, but how it arrived there. The burial was no longer an unsolved mystery of logistics. It was an engineered act, tied directly to a man who had already lied about his whereabouts and downplayed his connection to Kat. Yet even as the chain of evidence tightened, one gap remained: motive. The brothers' actions pointed toward concealment, but investigators still did not know what preceded it. Why bury her, car and all? Why not abandon the vehicle, strip it, or destroy it? The choice to enter the Honda in desert soil suggested something personal, something binding the crime to secrecy. Experts in behavioral forensics offered possible interpretations. Burials often carry symbolic weight, even when improvised. To bury a car with its belongings intact, maps folded, backpack zipped, was not just disposal, it was erasure. It suggested a need to hide every trace, to silence the object as much as the person connected to it. The brothers' access to equipment provided the how. The why remained obscured. Investigators pursued the financial trail next, suspecting that money often leaves the clearest motive. If machinery was rented, it was paid for. If jobs were claimed, invoices were filed. Following the paper meant uncovering not just logistics, but potentially the reason behind them. Still, the burial site remained a haunting testament. Detectives returned often to the image. A car hidden beneath sand and stone, locked and sealed, a time capsule of unanswered questions. It stood as proof of deliberate concealment and of a man who had access to the very tools needed to make her vanish. The soil revealed its story, but the heart of the mystery endured. The brother had means, access, and now undeniable ties to both the car and the remains. What investigators sought next was the one missing piece, the motive that could explain why he had buried her, car, and all. Financial records often provide insights that witnesses and suspects attempt to obscure. In Kat's case, her bank activity became a crucial thread. Investigators reviewing her accounts noticed a significant withdrawal in the days leading up to her disappearance. She had taken out $3,000 in cash, a large sum compared to her usual modest spending habits. No subsequent purchases or deposits accounted for the money. It was as if it vanished with her. The withdrawal caught attention not only because of the amount, but also because of the timing. It occurred just days before she was last seen at the gas station. For investigators already struggling with scattered clues, a buried car, a hidden necklace, fragments from a shallow pit, the financial anomaly introduced a new angle. Kat had accessed her money, but evidence showed she had not spent it on herself. Witness statements helped fill the gap. Friends and acquaintances recalled her speaking vaguely about wanting to help someone. She mentioned, more than once, that she intended to help someone get back on their feet. While she did not specify who, her tone suggested she felt a sense of obligation. She framed it not as charity, but as support for someone in need, someone close enough that she trusted the intention behind the act. Detectives began cross-referencing that phrase with individuals in her immediate orbit. Among them, one figure stood out: her brother. Financial records painted a picture of strain on his end: overdue bills, mounting debt, and a pattern of borrowing from those around him. The sum Kat had withdrawn matched the type of amount that might have been requested by someone facing urgent obligations. The possibility grew stronger when investigators revisited earlier evidence. Her brother's fingerprint had been found on the necklace hidden beneath the trailer's floorboard. His phone had been placed near her last known gas station. Now the financial trail suggested a motive layered on top of those physical links. If Kat had withdrawn money with the intent to help him, and if that help transformed into pressure for repayment, conflict could have followed. Detectives began to consider a scenario in which a debt was not just financial, but personal. Kat had attempted to provide stability to her brother, and when repayment became impossible, the tension between them escalated. The investigation's narrative shifted from chance encounters with strangers in the desert toward the possibility of family entanglement. Still, suspicion alone did not amount to proof. Prosecutors reviewing the case recognized the limitations of what had been gathered so far. Financial withdrawals could suggest intent, but they did not prove transfer. Witness statements could highlight her willingness to help, but they did not identify the recipient with certainty. Even the brother's debt profile while consistent with need, remained circumstantial. Without records tying the cash directly to him, the theory remained incomplete. Detectives worked to close the gap. They re-examined text logs and call histories, looking for mentions of money or repayment. They interviewed friends of the brother, probing whether he had spoken of sudden cash or assistance. No definitive statements emerged. Those close to him admitted he was struggling financially, but hesitated to confirm whether Kat had been his source of relief. The frustration among investigators grew. The pieces formed a pattern, yet the legal system required sharper edges. A necklace with his print, a phone near her last known location, and financial withdrawals suggesting motive, all of it pointed toward him. But none of it was sufficient on its own to sustain prosecution. For Kat's parents, the financial revelation deepened their despair. They understood their daughter's generosity, her inclination to help. They knew she would extend herself for her brother without hesitation. To them, the bank records confirmed a painful truth. She had once again tried to lift him, even in his darkest struggles. That act of kindness now appeared entwined with her disappearance. Investigators pressed forward, determined to strengthen the case. The working theory held that Kat had withdrawn money, entrusted it to her brother, and confronted him when repayment faltered. The confrontation, in their view, had spiraled into violence. But until more surfaced, it remained only a theory, unable to pass the threshold required in court. The search for that missing piece of evidence continued. And then, from an unexpected direction, it arrived, not in the form of financial records nor physical objects, but in the form of words. A confession was about to emerge, and not from the person investigators had been circling. The case had endured 14 years of silence, half-answers, and evidence that only hinted at the truth. Detectives had unearthed a buried car, traced fingerprints, dissected call logs, and followed financial trails, but the central question lingered: who had orchestrated Kat's disappearance, and why? That silence broke, unexpectedly, when the man once known only as the Drifter, the figure tied to the faded red pickup, was finally located. He had eluded authorities for years, drifting from state to state, leaving no permanent address. But time, more relentless than investigation, caught up with him. When detectives found him, he was no longer a shadowy figure on back roads. He was frail, weakened by illness, living in obscurity. His body was failing, but his memory remained sharp. With little left to lose, he agreed to speak. In a recorded interview, his words came slowly, labored, but steady. He admitted what he had never shared before. He had been involved in burying Kat's car. His account did not come with bravado, nor with eagerness to shift blame, but with the resigned tone of someone unburdening himself before death. According to his statement, he had not acted alone, nor by choice. He claimed the brother, the same man whose fingerprint was found in the Honda, whose voice echoed in Kat's final voicemail, whose rental of heavy machinery matched the burial, had approached him in 2007. He said the brother offered him payment, but when hesitation arose, the transaction became coercion. At gunpoint, he was forced to assist. He described being ordered to drive, to dig, to help conceal the car in the desert trench. His task was logistical, not violent, he insisted. He swore he had never harmed Kat, never even seen her after the night in question. His role, he claimed, was limited to helping erase what had already been done. Detectives listened carefully. His words were cross-checked against the evidence gathered over the years. What emerged was consistency. His description of the burial matched the soil analysis. A car lowered with machinery, not hidden by hand. His timeline aligned with the construction records showing equipment rented under the brother's name. His claim of coercion echoed the financial trail, where payments and sudden cash withdrawals hinted at transactions left unexplained. Even the smallest details reinforced the story. The Drifter recalled the torn seatbelt inside the Honda, the dust that filled the interior, the weight of silence as the trench was covered. These were not public details. not information released in media reports. They were fragments only someone physically present could have described. For detectives, the confession did not absolve him. Participation in concealment, whether coerced or not, tied him permanently to the crime, but his statement sharpened the narrative. Kat's disappearance had not been the work of a faceless stranger. It had been orchestrated by someone close, a betrayal from within her circle. The drifter's health left little time for protracted proceedings. His testimony was documented, verified, and added to the case file. His words confirmed what investigators had long suspected, but never proven outright. The burial was deliberate, engineered, and funded by the brother. The car in the desert was no accident, no random disposal. It was a concealed crime scene, carried out with force and intent. Still, one absence remained unfulfilled. Kat's body was never fully recovered. Despite extensive searches around the burial site, only fragments surfaced, insufficient to close every forensic gap. For her family, this absence was both devastating and final. They had answers about betrayal, about responsibility, about concealment, but they did not have her. The car, though, became her silent witness. Locked, buried, and unearthed after 14 years, it held within it the truth of what had been done. The maps, the backpack, the torn seatbelt. Each artifact preserved the story of a life cut short and a crime hidden. Together with the drifter's confession, they formed the clearest picture investigators would ever have. The conclusion was stark. Kat had not been lost on her road trip by misadventure, nor taken by chance. She had been led into a trap she never saw coming, orchestrated not by a stranger but by someone tethered to her through trust and proximity. Detectives closed their files with the recognition that justice, though partial, had been achieved. The truth lay not in speculation, but in the layers of soil, in the weight of silence, and in the words of a man who chose confession only when time gave him no other choice.